What if I told you that behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's golden age, two of the most famous leading men were living a secret life that could have destroyed their careers overnight? Picture this: lavish parties in hidden mansions, coded invitations, secret doors, and a love affair so dangerous that it had to be buried beneath layers of studio contracts and arranged marriages. Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero weren't just friends. They weren't just co-stars. They were lovers in an era when being gay could end everything you'd worked for, when one whisper could turn you from America's heartthrob into Hollywood's outcast. And yet, they managed to hide in plain sight, throwing some of the most exclusive, secretive parties the entertainment industry has ever known. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on one of old Hollywood's best-kept secrets, and trust me, what you're about to discover will change the way you see classic cinema forever. Let's start with Tyrone Power. If you don't know the name, imagine the Brad Pitt or the Timothée Chalamet of the 1940s. Women fainted at his premieres. Men wanted to be him. With his chiseled jaw, piercing eyes, and that smooth, elegant voice, Tyrone was the ultimate movie star. He appeared in massive hits like The Mark of Zorro, Blood and Sand, and Witness for the Prosecution. Studios marketed him as the perfect romantic hero, the kind of man who could sweep any woman off her feet. But here's what they didn't tell you. Behind closed doors, Tyrone Power was tormented. He was living a double life that required constant vigilance, endless lies, and a performance more convincing than anything he ever did on screen. Now, let's talk about Cesar Romero. You might remember him as the Joker from the 1960s Batman series, that cackling villain with the painted mustache. But before he became a camp icon, Cesar was a suave leading man himself, dancing his way through musicals and charming audiences with his Latin lover persona. Tall, handsome, and impossibly charismatic, Cesar was everywhere in Hollywood. And here's the thing: Cesar never married. Not once. In an era when studios forced their stars into marriages to maintain their straight image, Cesar Romero refused. He lived openly as a bachelor, and while most people assumed he was just a playboy, the truth was far more complicated. Cesar was gay, and unlike many of his peers, he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, at least not in private. So how did these two men meet? The story begins in the late 1930s when both were rising stars at 20th Century Fox. Hollywood back then was a factory system. Studios owned actors like property, controlling every aspect of their lives, from the roles they played to who they dated in public. Tyrone and Cesar were often cast in the same social circles, attending the same premieres, the same industry parties, the same exclusive club events. But it wasn't at a premiere or a studio lot where they truly connected. It was at one of Hollywood's underground gay gatherings, secret parties held in the hills above Los Angeles where actors, directors, designers, and writers could finally be themselves without fear of exposure. These parties were legendary. Invitations were passed by word of mouth. Locations changed constantly. There were code words, secret knocks, and trusted hosts who made sure no outsiders ever got in. George Cukor, the director of films like The Philadelphia Story and My Fair Lady, was famous for hosting these gatherings at his mansion. William Haynes, a silent film star who gave up acting to become Hollywood's top interior designer, threw parties that were whispered about for decades. And it was in these hidden spaces that Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero found each other. Imagine the relief they must have felt. For Tyrone, who was constantly pressured by the studio to maintain his image as a heterosexual heartthrob, these parties were the only place he could breathe. For Cesar, who was already more comfortable with his identity but still had to navigate a homophobic industry, these gatherings were a sanctuary. They bonded over shared experiences, the constant fear of exposure, the exhaustion of living a double life, and eventually, that bond became something deeper. Their relationship was built on secrecy, but also on genuine affection. Friends who knew them described a partnership that went beyond physical attraction. They understood each other in ways no one else could. Tyrone was more closeted, more anxious about being discovered. Cesar was his anchor, someone who had already made peace with who he was and helped Tyrone navigate the dangerous waters of Hollywood's closet. They traveled together, vacationed together, and when they were apart, they wrote letters full of coded language that only they could understand. But let's talk about those parties. The ones they threw together. By the 1940s, Tyrone and Cesar had become central figures in Hollywood's underground gay scene. They didn't just attend parties, they hosted them. These weren't small gatherings. We're talking about 50, 60, sometimes 100 guests, all carefully vetted, all part of the secret world that existed beneath Hollywood's shiny surface. The parties were held at private estates in Beverly Hills, Malibu, and the Hollywood Hills. Security was tight. Guests arrived in unmarked cars. There were always lookouts posted to warn if anyone suspicious approached. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Jazz bands played. Champagne flowed. The decor was extravagant, often designed by William Haynes himself, who was not only a friend but a frequent collaborator in creating these safe spaces. Men danced with men. Women danced with women. Conversations were honest and open in a way they could never be in public. For a few hours, these people could stop performing and just exist. Tyrone and Cesar were often at the center of it all, laughing, dancing, playing the roles of gracious hosts. But there was always an undercurrent of fear. One photograph. One disgruntled guest. One betrayal. That's all it would take to destroy everyone in that room. And the danger was very real. Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s was ruthless when it came to homosexuality. The Hays Code, which governed film content, explicitly banned any positive depiction of gay people. Studios had morality clauses in their contracts that allowed them to drop actors for any behavior deemed scandalous. The tabloid press was always hungry for a career-ending scoop. And then there were the police. Gay bars were raided regularly. People were arrested, their names published in newspapers, their lives destroyed. Even attending a private party could be dangerous if the wrong people found out, so how did Tyrone and Cesar get away with it for so long? The answer lies in the studio system's power and their own careful maneuvering. 20th Century Fox had too much invested in Tyrone Power to let him fall. He was one of their biggest stars, a guaranteed box office draw. So the studio protected him, but at a price. They arranged marriages for him, first to actress Annabella, a French star who was likely aware of the arrangement, and later to Linda Christian, a Mexican actress who became a tabloid fixture. These marriages were business transactions, designed to maintain Tyrone's heterosexual image. Behind closed doors, he continued his relationship with Cesar. Cesar, on the other hand, played a different game. He refused to marry, which was almost unheard of for a leading man of his stature. When asked about it in interviews, he would laugh it off, saying he was married to his career, or that he hadn't found the right woman. The press bought it because Cesar was so charming, so likable, that he could get away with it. But people in the industry knew. They just didn't talk about it. There was an unspoken agreement in Hollywood. As long as you were discreet, as long as you didn't embarrass the studios, your private life was your own. But discretion had its limits. There were close calls. Rumors circulated. Blind items in gossip columns hinted at unnamed actors with secret lives. In 1952, a scandal nearly broke when a disgruntled former employee of one of the party hosts threatened to go public with photographs. The studios moved quickly, paying off the blackmailer and ensuring the photos never saw the light of day. Tyrone was reportedly devastated by the incident, becoming even more paranoid about exposure. Cesar, ever the steady presence, helped him through it. Their relationship wasn't just about romance. It was about survival. They looked out for each other in an industry that would have chewed them up and spit them out if given the chance. When Tyrone went off to serve in World War II as a Marine pilot, Cesar kept their circle safe, maintaining the network of friends and allies who protected their secret. When Cesar faced career setbacks in the 50s as his leading man days faded, Tyrone used his influence to help him land roles. But the strain took its toll. Tyrone's marriages were sources of genuine pain for both men. Linda Christian, his second wife, was reportedly unaware of his sexuality at first, and when she began to suspect, their relationship became explosive. There were fights, separations, and eventually divorce. For Cesar, watching the man he loved go through these forced relationships was agonizing. Friends later said that Cesar never seriously dated anyone else during the years he and Tyrone were together. He remained devoted, even when it meant watching Tyrone play the role of heterosexual husband in public. The 1950s brought new challenges. The McCarthy era wasn't just about hunting communists. It was also a time of intense persecution of gay people. The Lavender Scare, as it's now known, saw thousands of gay men and women fired from government jobs, blacklisted, and publicly shamed. Hollywood, always sensitive to public opinion, became even more cautious. The underground party scene that had flourished in the 40s became riskier. Some hosts stopped throwing parties altogether. Others moved their gatherings to more remote locations. Tyrone and Cesar scaled back their hosting, but they never stopped entirely. The parties were too important, not just for them, but for the dozens of other actors, writers, and crew members who needed those spaces to survive. As the decade progressed, both men's careers began to shift. Tyrone moved into more mature, dramatic roles, proving he was more than just a pretty face. His performance in Witness for the prosecution earned critical acclaim and reminded Hollywood why he'd been a star for so long. Cesar transitioned into character work, eventually landing the role that would define his later career, the Joker on the Batman TV series. Ironically, the role that made him a camp icon also gave him a new kind of freedom. Camp, with its exaggerated performances and winking humor, became a way for gay men to express themselves in plain sight. Cesar embraced it fully, and audiences loved him for it. But by the late 50s, Tyrone's health was declining. The stress of his double life, combined with heavy smoking and the physical demands of his career, had taken a toll. In 1958, while filming Solomon and Sheba in Spain, Tyrone Power suffered a massive heart attack during a sword-fighting scene. He was only 44 years old. Cesar was in Los Angeles when he got the news. Friends say he was inconsolable. The man he had loved for nearly 20 years was gone, and he couldn't even publicly mourn him. There was no funeral appearance as a grieving partner. No acknowledgement of what they'd meant to each other. Cesar had to grieve in private, surrounded by the same circle of friends who had protected their secret for so long. After Tyrone's death, Cesar continued working for decades. He became a beloved figure in Hollywood, known for his professionalism, his kindness, and his refusal to ever speak ill of anyone. But he never had another serious relationship. Those who knew him said he never got over Tyrone. He kept photographs of them together, hidden away in his home. He attended memorial events for Tyrone, always staying in the background, always careful not to draw attention to his grief. Cesar Romero lived until 1994, passing away at the age of 86. He never publicly came out. He never confirmed the relationship with Tyrone Power, though by the time of his death, many in Hollywood knew the truth. In his final years, as attitudes toward homosexuality began to shift, some friends encouraged him to tell his story. He always refused. "That was a different time," he would say. "We did what we had to do." And perhaps he was right. Coming out posthumously, through memoirs or interviews, might have felt like a betrayal of the very discretion that had kept him and Tyrone safe for so long. But their story didn't end with their deaths. Over the years, historians, biographers, and journalists have pieced together the truth about Hollywood's secret gay community. Books like The Celluloid Closet and Behind the Screen have documented the underground networks, the parties, the relationships that were hidden in plain sight. Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero's names come up again and again in these accounts. Friends have spoken, carefully and respectfully, about what they knew. Letters have been analyzed. Photographs have been examined. And slowly, the full picture has emerged. What we're left with is a love story, yes, but also a story about survival, about the impossible choices people had to make in a time when being yourself could cost you everything. Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero weren't just victims of a homophobic system. They were also rebels who carved out spaces of freedom wherever they could. Those parties, those secret gatherings, weren't just about having a good time. They were acts of resistance. They were declarations that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people will find ways to be themselves, to love who they love, to create community. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's easy to look back at old Hollywood and see only the glamour, the beautiful people in beautiful clothes making beautiful movies. But beneath that surface was a world of secrecy, of fear, of people living double lives because they had no other choice. Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero were part of that world, but they were also more than that. They found love. They built a life together, even if it had to be hidden. They protected each other. And they left behind a legacy that, decades later, we're finally beginning to understand and honor. Today, when we watch The Mark of Zorro or Batman, we're not just seeing performances. We're seeing men who were fighting battles we couldn't see, who were carrying secrets that would have destroyed them if revealed. We're seeing love that had to hide, but that was no less real for being hidden. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember. Love doesn't need public validation to be true. Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero loved each other in a time when that love was criminalized, stigmatized, and erased. But it was real. And it mattered. So the next time you see one of their films, remember the full story. Remember the parties in the Hollywood Hills, the secret codes, the careful discretion, and the love that survived despite everything. Remember that history is full of untold stories, and that some of the most powerful love stories are the ones that had to be lived in secret. Tyrone Power and Cesar Romero gave us great performances on screen, but their greatest performance was the one they gave off screen, pretending to be something they weren't so they could protect the truth of who they really were. And in doing that, they became heroes in a way that no movie role could ever capture. Their story is a reminder that queer history has always been part of Hollywood history, even when it was hidden. And it's a reminder that love, in all its forms, finds a way.